Most people have discipline completely backwards. They have been taught, through the language of hustle culture, through the aesthetic of 5 a.m. alarm clocks and ice baths, and the performance of suffering as a proxy for seriousness, that discipline is fundamentally about restriction, about saying no, about the removal of pleasure and comfort and ease in service of a harder, leaner, more productive version of living. That the more it costs you, the more disciplined you are. That discomfort is the evidence of commitment, and enjoyment is the enemy of progress. This understanding of discipline is not just wrong. It is the reason most people cannot sustain it. Because a system built on deprivation has a structural flaw that no amount of willpower can permanently overcome. It is always in tension with the human need for pleasure, rest, and enjoyment, which means it is always one difficult week away from collapse. And when it collapses, as it always does, the person inside it does not conclude that the system was wrong. They conclude that they were weak, that they lacked the discipline to be disciplined. And they rebuild the same system, tighter this time, and wait for it to collapse again. Real discipline is not a cage. It is a compass. Roland spent 6 years building cages and wondering why he kept breaking out of them before he understood the difference. Stay with us, because today we are telling the story of a man who mistook severity for discipline and paid the price repeatedly, and what he slowly and painfully came to understand about what sustainable discipline actually looks like. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because somebody out there needs to hear exactly this today. Rollins was 31 years old and had a complicated relationship with discipline that had been causing him problems for the better part of a decade. Not a lack of discipline, the opposite. Rollins had discipline in the way that certain people have it when they have decided that the capacity for self-denial is the measure of their seriousness. He could restrict himself with remarkable thoroughness when the conviction was present. He had done elimination diets that removed entire food groups for months at a time. He had maintained workout schedules of 6 days a week that left no room for deviation or recovery. He had imposed work routines so rigid that any interruption to their structure felt like a personal failure requiring immediate correction. He could sustain these regimes for impressive periods. He could not sustain them indefinitely. Nobody could. And the endings were always the same, not gradual relaxations but full collapses. The way a wall held rigid against pressure eventually fails not by bending but by breaking. The diet abandoned not for a reasonable meal, but for 3 weeks of eating everything he had been restricting. The workout schedule dropped not to 5 days but to 0 for a month, sometimes longer. The work routine shattered by one disrupted week into a period of unstructured days that he could not reassemble until the next surge of conviction arrived. The cycle had a rhythm Rollins knew intimately and hated deeply. Build a system. Maintain it with white-knuckled consistency. Feel the pressure accumulate, break, recover, build again. He had always interpreted the breaking as failure of character, as evidence that he was not, at his core, as disciplined as he needed to be, that the system was right, and the person implementing it was the variable that needed correcting. So each rebuild came with more structure, more restriction, fewer concessions to the parts of him that had eventually broken the previous version. Tighter, harder, less room for weakness. The tighter systems broke faster than the looser ones had. The realization that something fundamental was wrong with his understanding arrived not suddenly, but gradually, accumulated across a series of observations that Rollins resisted drawing conclusions from for longer than the evidence warranted. The first observation was a colleague named Warren. Warren was 42, fit in the sustainable way of someone who had been consistently active for 20 years, rather than the intermittent way of someone cycling through intense periods and their aftermath. He did not have a rigid training schedule. He went to the gym when it fit his week, walked when he preferred walking, took rest when his body indicated rest was needed. He ate well in the general sense of a person who had developed genuine preferences for food that served him, not as an act of restriction, but as a natural expression of what he actually wanted most of the time. Rowlands had privately assessed Warren's approach for years as insufficiently serious, as the kind of moderate, unsystematic relationship with health that produced moderate results, until he looked at the actual results and found them, measured honestly against his own across the same period, to be superior in every metric that mattered: consistency, physical condition, and the evident absence of the exhausting boom and bust cycle that had characterized Rowlands' approach for a decade. Warren was not more disciplined than Rowlands in the sense Rowlands had always used the word. He was disciplined differently, in a way that did not require the constant application of force against resistance, because the resistance was lower, because the system was built around what he genuinely wanted rather than around the removal of what he wanted. The second observation came from within. Rowlands was in month 4 of his most recent rebuild, a particularly thorough version prompted by an unusually complete collapse of the previous one, when he noticed something he had not paid attention to before. The things he was most consistently able to maintain across all versions of his disciplined self were not the hardest ones. They were the ones he had stopped experiencing as restrictions. The morning coffee made carefully rather than grabbed quickly, initially imposed as part of a slow morning routine, now simply something he enjoyed. The weekly long walk, initially scheduled as active recovery, now something he looked forward to genuinely. The reading before bed, initially a replacement for screen time, now a genuine preference. These things had not required willpower in months. They had become, without him fully noticing the transition, simply what he did, not because he was forcing himself but because they had crossed the threshold from imposed behavior to genuine preference, from cage to compass. The behaviors that still required force, the ones that had never stopped feeling like deprivation, that produced the pressure that always eventually broke the system, were the ones he had never allowed to become genuine preferences because they had been designed around removal rather than replacement, around the elimination of what he wanted rather than the development of wanting something different. He sat with this for a long time. The conclusion it eventually produced was one that felt almost too simple to be the answer to a problem he had been wrestling with for years. Sustainable discipline is not the capacity to deny yourself indefinitely. It is the patient, deliberate process of building genuine preferences for the behaviors that serve you, so that over time the system requires less force to maintain, because the person inside it has actually changed, not just the rules they are operating under. The cage model tried to change behavior while leaving the person unchanged, applying external structure against internal resistance indefinitely, which was always going to be a finite proposition. The compass model changed the person. Slowly, through exposure and experience and the gradual discovery that the things he had been forcing himself to do contained genuine value that he had been too focused on the forcing to notice. Rowlands did not dismantle his system. He redesigned it. He kept the behaviors that had crossed from imposed to genuine and released the ones that had been producing pressure without producing results. He replaced the rigid all-or-nothing structures with more flexible frameworks that had room for the variation of a real life, without treating that variation as failure. He paid attention, for the first time, to which parts of the system he was defending out of genuine conviction, and which parts he was defending out of the belief that difficulty was the measure of seriousness. The system that emerged was quieter than any he had previously built, and it was the first one he had ever maintained without breaking, not because he had finally found sufficient willpower, because he had finally stopped building something that required willpower to hold together. Discipline is not how much you can deny yourself. It is how well you can align your daily behavior with what you actually want for your life, and how skillfully you can build systems that make that alignment feel natural rather than forced over time. The person who sustains their health, their work, their relationships, their growth over decades is not the person who imposes the strictest structure and maintains it through sheer force of will. It is the person who has learned to build systems that work with human nature rather than against it, that have room for rest and pleasure, and the full texture of a real life without treating that texture as a threat to the discipline. Real discipline does not feel like a cage. It feels like clarity, like a compass that points consistently toward what matters without requiring you to suffer for the pointing. Roland spent 6 years building cages he could not stay inside. The day he understood that the problem was the cage was the day he built something he could actually live in. Discipline is not deprivation. It is direction. And direction, consistently followed, will take you further than any cage ever could. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.